Romanticism Come of Age, a second edition of the biography of Owen Barfield by Simon Blaxland-de Lange. Bruce Charlton. Blaxland-de Lange's is the only biography of Owen Barfield, and it is very good. Indeed, because its greatest strength is that Blaxland-de Lange has such a deep understanding of Barfield's ideas, this biography is a way by which someone could approach reading Barfield from scratch. By reading the biography first, the potential explorer can discover which of Barfield's very various books he would be most likely to enjoy and appreciate, and therefore where he might best start reading. The biography's great strength might also be regarded as a stumbling block, which is that Blaxland-de Lange is, like Barfield, a serious, indeed professional, anthroposophist, a follower of Rudolf Steiner. This has the great advantage of providing valid and thorough explanations of this aspect of Barfield, which aspect is usually so badly covered by most other writers about Barfield, few of whom have made the considerable effort necessary to get to grips with Steiner's vast oeuvre. On the other hand, the book is written on the basis of anthroposophical assumptions, and includes reference to Steiner concepts that will strike the naive reader as bizarre, as well as startling. Yet, there is also a good deal of Steiner, and indeed the core of his work, that is potentially of primary importance to everyone, so to attain understanding is well worth a bit of effort. The organization of the book is somewhat eccentric. It begins conventionally enough, with a biographical sketch which gives an overview of Barfield's life, and some of the major incidents, ending with some snapshots of his attitudes and concerns at the end of his 99-year life. After this, the book is presented in a thematic way, with different chapters covering different aspects of Barfield's life and ideas, and these chapters are not in any overall chronological arrangement, but instead each chapter includes whatever is relevant to its particular concern. This means that, after the first overview, the book chapters can be read, without loss, in almost any order, and this has been my practice over the decade plus since I bought the first edition. Second edition differences are minimal. Indeed, I could only myself detect the addition of an appendix making available for the first time Psychography, which was an aborted draft attempt, from the late 1940s, at a spiritual autobiography by Barfield, which runs at 12 pages, and stops in Barfield's late teens. This is well worth reading, as a further insight into some fundamental aspects of Barfield, including his extreme shyness and reserve in talking on the topic of himself. For instance, he writes about the psychological effects of his problem with stammering, but never actually says what that problem was. If the reader did not already know about this problem from elsewhere, then the passage would be highly mystifying, and the problem sounds more sinister and shameful than it actually was. In sum, Romanticism Come of Age is probably the only indispensable book about Owen Barfield. Anyone who is interested by Barfield will want a copy, and will consult it frequently. Focusing on inner Christianity is neither surrender nor defeat. Francis Berger. An increasing number of Christians are, finally, waking up to the reality that their churches are becoming ever more aligned with system ideology, beliefs, principles, values, ethics, morals, opinion, and teaching. The outlook for churches is entirely negative, with no meaningful reversal or repentance on the horizon. Things are going to get a lot worse, and there's no sign that they will get better, at least not in the short to mid-term. So, what's a faithful, church-going Christian to do? Before we dip into that, it's imperative to stress the one thing a faithful, church-going Christian should not do, and that one thing is to stop being a Christian. Christians whose faith, principles, convictions and identity are wholly contingent upon external considerations like churches and communities will be forced to make a decisive and potentially divisive choice in the near future. Continue down the perilous path of escalating corruption, degeneracy, and profligacy under the questionable assumption that all is well and God is in charge. or take a stand and spiritually reject exterior Christianity's streamlining calibration with the demonic system. I use the term exterior Christianity above because I believe we are already far past the point of being able to devotedly and conscientiously rely upon external, moderate, everyday Christianity. That aspect of Christianity has been thoroughly dismantled. It would take an unfathomably insincere imagination to envision that what is coming up in its place is in any way remotely related to Christ. Those convinced that they are safely barricaded behind some unassailable exterior Christian fortification will eventually find themselves in the same situation as Christians in vanquished or less defended bastions. All externals are vulnerable. They will inevitably be assimilated, corrupted, or destroyed. Christians are well into a potentially devastating time of choice and division. No Christian will be spared these choices and divisions. Do I recommend abandoning all aspects of exterior Christianity? Not necessarily. Such a choice depends on individual circumstances. However, if one continues to adhere to exterior Christianity, the adherence must be outweighed by an elevation and intensification of interior Christianity. Contrary to popular Christian belief, elevating and intensifying the internal does not signify a retreat from the external. It is not quietism, or submission or fatalism. It does not mean digging in. It does not mean surrender. Very little is relinquished. Quite the opposite. The elevation and intensification of inward Christianity is an advance. A step forward. A breakthrough. The forces of darkness utilize external, temporal means to achieve internal, eternal ends. They use the external to demoralize, humiliate, infuriate, tempt, and goad. They enthusiastically invite external reactions unsupported by elevated and intensified internals. It makes little difference to them if rage and resentment or despondency and despair fuel the reaction. Either way, all is lost in the eternal, which is the ultimate aim. One way or another, Christians will have to go through what the demonic forces have lined up before them, and they will have to come out the other side or be lost. The only open question is what they rely on to carry them to the other side. Jesus Christ, and the Second Creation. Bruce Charlton. By second creation I mean heaven, and that heaven was made a possibility by the work of Jesus Christ. I feel strongly that what Jesus offered to men was an added possibility, resurrection and heaven, added to what was possible before Jesus. Yet, because it became available, and was something brought to the attention of all, after death, if not before, the act of choosing to accept or reject heaven, takes on a significance that did not exist before Jesus. It is rather like someone offered promotion at work. Whether he accepts or declines that promotion, either way there are consequences. After the choice, he is not the same as before the choice. The reality of that choice is unavoidable transformation. So it is with resurrection. The possibility of choosing to live wholly by love, choosing our own transformation to become wholly good and immortal, to leave behind all of us that is corruption, disease, sin, and death. That chance/choice/offer is bound to change us, whether we accept or reject the possibility. To know and reject a reality of good, is different from never having had the possibility of becoming good. Thus hell arose as a consequence of heaven. But why must we die to become good? Presumably, because of the profundity of the transformation. We must be unmade before we can sufficiently be remade. But why must we incarnate, and into mortal bodies? Why not resurrect from being spirits, or incarnate directly into resurrected bodies? Because we must be bounded from God in order, eternally, to choose God, to affiliate with God, to be remade, such as we shall thence be eternally affiliated with God in love. Such a decision can only be made from a situation of separation from God. Such an outcome can only come from active participation in the remaking of the self, which again requires separation of the individual will from God. We must stand apart and on our own feet, in order to be able to come together, with two purposes and two wills in eternal and loving harmony. So an intermediate stage of incarnate but mortal life is necessary between premortal spirit and postmortal resurrected life. What about Jesus? Was he predestined from before incarnation to do what he did? No, that cannot be. Jesus must have been fully an agent in order to do what he did, therefore he was not constrained to choose as he did, but he freely chose to do what he did, from his own nature and self. It was not foreknown that Jesus would be the Christ until he made that commitment, and became the Christ. Anything else denies his agency, and destroys the necessity for Jesus' divinity. Jesus first became divine, at his baptism, apparently, then died, was resurrected, and finally ascended to heaven. He did this that we men may achieve the same end result, but in a different order. We, in contrast to Jesus, first die, and then are resurrected to eternal divine life in heaven, i.e. divinity, resurrection, heaven, come after death and, pretty much, all at once, it seems. One exception, Lazarus was resurrected through the divine nature of Jesus, but before Jesus was resurrected, and only later, if at all, unrecorded, ascended to heaven. Such exceptions are part of God's nature and working, because all individual men are unique, indeed, all beings are unique, so it would make no sense to be constrained to deal with multitudes of unique beings in accordance with a standard pattern. By the very nature of things, there will be exceptions, therefore, exceptions to regularities or rules, are actually part of the rules. In sum, I find it very helpful to regard the work of Jesus Christ as a second creation. The second creation was not logically necessary, it was instead a gift, an offer, a possibility. After death, a man might choose to remain in the first creation, with various possibilities, or else to undergo the transformation called resurrection, requisite to dwell eternally in the second creation. This possibility of heaven changed the human condition thenceforth. Because to accept, or to reject, this gift, this possibility, divides mankind, divides indeed all the beings of creation. How is it that Western civilization keeps on not collapsing, so far? Bruce Charlton. Anyone who was driven, by some inner compulsion, to read this blog in chronological order, from the summer of 2010 when I began to write on a daily basis, would rapidly discover that I have been expecting, therefore in a sense predicting, the collapse of our civilization, for most of the past 12 years. Clearly, that has not happened. At least, not yet, and it is interesting to speculate why not. I am as sure now as I was then that our system is unsustainable, and for a multitude of reasons, that multitudinousness of individually fatal stresses being why the civilization is inevitably doomed, since all causes cannot be addressed at once, or quickly enough, even if there was a will to reverse the causes of collapse, which there is not. Also because, and for the first time in history, a deliberate and strategic, top-down program for destruction of Western civilization. This encompasses neglecting, worsening and denying natural problems, such subfertility, which is itself a consequence of deliberately encouraged religious apostasy and the exclusion of the spiritual from public discourse. And gratuitously creating many new and individually lethal system stresses, mass immigration, climate change, anti-racism, birdemic peck etc. If this analysis is broadly correct, how, then, has the system survived? The answer I have gradually come to accept is that the conspiracy theorist point of view is broadly true, in that most of the acute problems, apparent emergencies, and genuine catastrophes, are either permitted or actively caused by the system itself. And therefore, when the system feels threatened, it simply stops causing these problems. It is relatively easy to stop creating crises, because people, on the whole, will only cause problems when encouraged, assisted and subsidized to do so. Thus, huge areas of national or local crisis can, if the will exists, be all but eliminated, simply by removing the massive structures of positives incentives that have been their ultimate cause. The reason I took so foolishly long to recognize the self-caused nature of most crises and emergencies, is that I used to know, from personal experience, a fair bit about the people who were leaders at a regional and national level, and I realized that they believed in what they were doing, believed that they were doing good with their various lethal schemes. And therefore it seemed to me that national elites were observably not conspiring actively to inflict social problems. Where I went wrong is assuming that the regional/national leadership class were actual leaders. I did not then see that all their important instructions were coming down from a much smaller, supranational global elite, which was the level at which strategic decisions were made. National governments and media, multinational corporations and large social institutions, such as the UK National Health Service, are just middle managers, just minions, just implementers of plans, set at different levels. In other words, it is at the large, geopolitical, scale where the ultimate decisions are made and the ultimate causes of many problems set into motion. Vast areas such as the economy, finance, science, health, the mass media etc. are managed to a very high degree. Visible, impacting, crises and problems in all of major social systems are mostly deliberately caused, but caused at a hierarchical level far above the level at which they are managed. Thus the managers are often genuinely striving, in their minds, albeit dishonestly and incompetently, to address the problems. Albeit, among managers addressing a problem does not mean solving or eliminating the problem, it means responding to it, doing something that can plausibly, i.e. plausibly to managers, be argued to be a positive and helpful response, within the constraints of careerism and bureaucratization. Anyway, setting aside nuances for the sake of clarity, while the system or Western civilization is indeed doomed to collapse, I have often been fooled by deliberately caused crises and emergencies, into believing that the collapse was imminent, whereas, because the acute crisis/emergency, whether of the economy, finance, health, or whatever, was deliberately caused, the crisis/emergency could later, when it had caused the desired results, and, at least, up until now, just as easily be cured. So much for the surface. Deep down, however, the longer the system persists while continuing to be degraded, and while its efficiency, effectiveness, and self-regulating honesty are all incrementally being destroyed, the more that the depth and breadth of eventual/inevitable collapse will continue to increase. So the good news is that Western civilization has not collapsed yet, but continues along its paths of value inversion, mass spiritual damnation, and the active pursuit of evil goals. The bad news is that, when it does happen, and it will, the collapse of the West will now be far worse than it would have been a decade ago. Truth versus Christianity, which ought to come first? Bruce Charlton.
He who begins by loving Christianity better than truth, will proceed by loving his own sect or church better than Christianity, and end in loving himself better than all.
Aphorism 25, From Aids to Reflection by S.D. Coleridge. Coleridge's aphorism is true, but the but comes from something about truth that is apparent to us now, in a way that was not to Coleridge a century ago. This something is that truth, as Coleridge meant it, is rooted in Christianity, such that the modern post-Christian/secular idea of truth has been fatally weakened as a personal motivator, even when it has not been altogether demoted to insignificance, or inverted to serve expediency. In other words, Coleridge is actually drawing a distinction here between what might be termed fidelity to divinely created reality, which is what Coleridge calls truth, and the diktat of what official church authorities happen currently to be asserting, which is what Coleridge calls Christianity. Coleridge is implicitly stating the romantic recognition, optional then, unavoidable now, that our personal conviction of truth does and should have priority over institutional aspects, or that individual discernment and judgments are primary, and organizational statements are secondary. More simply still, we are each of us necessarily and unavoidably responsible for the content of our religion. Maslow's metamotivation is false self-actualization. Francis Berger. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs ranks among the most well-known and influential motivation theories of psychology, mostly because it appeals to and is readily comprehensible to modern, post-Christian, or anti-Christian despiritualized consciousness. Maslow's theory is simple, so simple that it is depicted as a 5-tier pyramid, not Maslow's invention. Physiological needs, the essentials of physical survival, form the pyramid base. Above that are the safety needs, followed by love and belonging needs. Esteem needs come next before the pyramid is capped with something Maslow refers to as self-actualization. Without getting into too much detail, the essential idea is the needs on the lower end of the pyramid must be fulfilled and satisfied before higher needs can be pursued and attained. Like many theories, Maslow's hierarchy of needs contains much of what qualifies as truth for the modern, despiritualized consciousness. After all, a starving, destitute human will likely be less motivated to compose a great symphony than a properly nourished human who can focus on pursuits higher than mere survival. On the other hand, the motivation to create great works has inspired many great artists and thinkers to willingly sacrifice meals, resources, and stability for creativity, demonstrating that Maslow's theory is far from flawless. Maslow's motivation theory started me thinking about Christian motivation. Suffice it to say, the hierarchy of needs is not constructed upon a Christian framework but is instead the brainchild of an atheist who flatly eschewed religion and the spiritual. With this in mind, it becomes readily apparent that Maslow's self-actualization capstone is the entirely humanistic ideal of reaching one's full potential and becoming the best version of oneself that one is capable of becoming. After the hierarchy of needs became well-known and influential, Maslow revisited his original 5-tier framework, found it wanting, and added transcendence above self-actualization. Why an atheist, humanist psychologist would feel inspired to add this extra level is a question I can't answer confidently. However, Maslow obviously sensed the gaping void in consciousness above self-actualization and tried to address it as best as he could. Maslow's level of transcendence has since been mostly ignored. Whenever it is addressed, it is usually from the nebulous perspective of New Ageism, replete with its cosmic consciousness, mindfulness, and connectedness. Maslow himself was slippery on definitions. More often than not, he insisted on achieving peak experiences or veered toward altruism and other ideals of selflessness as examples of transcendence. Or he claimed that transcendence ultimately had something to do with overcoming the self. Imagine that. You spend your whole life struggling towards self-actualization only to dissolve or dilute the self. How noble! How virtuous! How wondrous religion! How cosmic! The bottom line on Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the lack of authentic spiritual motivation. Since individual human beings are ultimately going nowhere, the best they can hope for is the fundamentally meaningless pursuit of self-fulfillment followed by a gentle assimilation into the great void of nothingness, all to the sound of a soothing The hierarchy of needs remains immensely popular and is a cornerstone of the positive psychology movement. Unfortunately, meeting the needs ensconced in Maslow's hierarchy in today's world entails submitting to and complying with the anti-God, anti-creation system, and its endless cascade of value inversion, particularly when it comes to esteem and self-actualization. However, even the most rudimentary physiological and safety needs require submission and complicity, which raises the question of how Christians can expect to meet Maslow's higher-level growth needs when they are already being pressured at the lower deficiency need levels. Little wonder many Christians yearn to return to Christendom or, at the very least, mid-20th century America. From a Christian perspective, it is imperative to stress that the self that yearns for actualization in Maslow's hierarchy is a false self. Christian motivation is clear and simple and can be reduced to two overarching goals: salvation and theosis. Both motivations ideally aim for the emergence of the real self, a self that Maslow's theory flatly dismisses or conspires to deny. With this in mind, Christians would be wise to reconstruct Maslow's hierarchy by adding salvation and theosis to every tier. After all, the motivation for salvation and theosis should not be and cannot be eclipsed by any deficiency need or growth need, including the basic physiology needs, and any growth need that does incorporate salvation and theosis as the primary motivation is not a growth need, at least not in the Christian sense. I'll return to this theme in future post. Radical implications of the Mandela effect. Bruce Charlton. I have written before about what I think is really going on in the discussions of the Mandela effect. Another way of thinking about it is that it is to do with concepts of time. Some 20 years ago, I wrote an essay about the contrast between ceremonial time and technological time. Ceremonial time could be called subjective time, based on human memory as it works in an oral and illiterate culture, whereas technological time is the now dominant, modern idea of time as objective, consensual, and where the bottom line is in written history and scientific concepts and measures. My feeling is that much discussion of the Mandela effect is rooted in a spontaneous, to young children and ancestral men, unconscious and instinctive desire to reassert the primacy of ceremonial time, rooted in spontaneous, emotionally inflected, and human-centered memory. But this is exactly because rooted in the unconscious and instinctive, hence opaque to analysis, confused by trying to hold on to various aspects of technological time. For instance, the reality of the Mandela effect is asserted by referencing books and other written material, or movie films, TV, computers, and other technologies that have significant roots outside of the mind, in memory cues that are materialized in symbolic, encoded, linguistic, and visual representations. The debate focuses on asserts about differences between past and present artifacts. And it focuses on trying to convince other people about the validity of our own memories compared with current public information. I find this contradictory. This is moving back and forth between the official and external, now and then, and back and forth between our own subjective memories and the attempt to make others regard our assertions about these memories as externally valid truths. But if we desire to assert the primacy of the subjective, directly known and human, then we should not use the objective, symbolic and technological as evidence. Discussion of the Mandela effects seems to arise from a profound dissatisfaction at the destructive violence that our bureaucratic mass media and totalitarian world is doing to both our basic humanity and freedom, and furthermore our spiritual nature and destiny. As such, I think it points at a much more extreme and radically different way of thinking and being than such discourse currently attains. I think the concern over would-be Mandela effects should be addressed by making the choice to root our primary assumptions concerning reality in that which is not just our own memories and reasoning, which are, after all, subject to change, including distortions, but to root them in a vision of life as, ultimately, a matter of living beings who are in relationships. Therefore, altogether separate from, and immune to, the domination of external, institutional and codified forms of knowing. We each need to develop a separate interior discourse from that which imposes upon us from externally, from the public, officialdom, the media. This interior discourse needs to be Christian, by which I mean our inner discourse needs to be aligned with, in harmony with, the purposes and nature of divine creation, insofar as we can know this. If such an inner and God-orientated discourse includes significant knowledge that contradicts what we are being told by public institutions that we know to be corrupt, at best, and, increasingly, demonic in overall control, well, then we know what we ought to believe in our hearts, don't we? In which case, trying to convince others that 1. Their understanding of 2. Our reports of 3. What we currently remember is pretty irrelevant, both to us, and even more to them. They ought to be doing the inner work for themselves, otherwise, their discourse will simply be a different variant of passively accepting external data, which is, both cognitively and spiritually, much like soaking up official media propaganda. Nearly everyone in the West has achieved transcendence. Francis Berger. One of the hallmarks of an unchristian or anti-Christian consciousness is a movement away from the concrete in favor of the abstract, with the ultimate expression of this being the dissolution of the self and its absorption and assimilation into something higher or deeper. This sort of transcendence is unchristian for the simple reason that Christianity should be about freeing and transforming the self, all without losing the concrete essence of the self. If Christianity is about anything, it is about working through our superficial, sinful, fearful, false selves and finding our realist and most concrete self. A Christian who chooses to follow Jesus to heaven does so as a person, as a concrete self, sans all the false selves accumulated during mortal life. Heaven is not a place of non-entities, but of selves who have chosen to abandon all abstractions and align themselves with God in the most concrete way possible, love. Christian love is concrete love. It is love directed at beings rather than ideas. It does not drift about in the diaphanous ether loving everything and anything that is or isn't there. It emerges from a concrete self and engages with another concrete self at the most concrete level of existence, the spiritual. Modern consciousness has inverted the concrete/abstract dichotomy by elevating the abstract above the concrete, and when I say above, I mean far above. It sees nothing special or noble in loving that which is near, real, tangible, and concrete. In fact, it often regards such love as selfish or non-inclusive. Value-inverted modern consciousness sees concrete love as limited, limiting, and exclusionary. If I choose to love my actual neighbor, I limit my capacity to love faraway strangers. Loving my local place of inhabitance is not love but rather an expression of fear and hatred of other places that I am unfamiliar with. The modern world demands that love be unlimited and unfocused. Thus, loving all human beings is infinitely superior to loving just a handful of human beings. Loving the world is much nobler than loving your town, city, or country. Loving all cultures is far more virtuous than loving your own cultures. Of course, the highest virtue of all is loving mankind while simultaneously denigrating the concrete people in your life. Same applies to nations and cultures. I bring this up because Christians should be motivated by salvation and theosis, both firmly rooted in the concrete. Following Jesus is a concrete decision based on a relationship between two selves. The choice to become more godlike is the decision of a concrete self striving to become more concrete. When we choose to follow Jesus, we are following Jesus, not the idea of Jesus. Striving to be godlike entails being less rather than more abstract in our thinking and action. The philosophy and psychology people in the West have absorbed over the centuries tends to value the abstract over the concrete. Unfortunately, Christians are not immune, with altruism representing the most egregious Christian error in this regard. Christians must use discernment when engaging with philosophical and psychological theories. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I touched upon briefly yesterday, is an example of why such discernment is indispensable. I don't believe Maslow was an intentionally malicious soul. As an idealist, he regarded humanity positively and was generally pointing in the right direction, but without the spiritual, more specifically, without a concrete belief in Christ, his well-meaning motivational theory has not only failed to pan out but has effectively done far more harm than good, as exemplified by his definition of transcendence as becoming more godlike.
Transcendence also means to become divine or godlike, to go beyond the merely human. But one must be careful here not to make anything extra-human or supernatural out of this kind of statement. I am thinking of using the word metahuman or behuman in order to stress that this becoming very high or divine or godlike is part of human nature, even though it is not often seen in fact. It is still a potentiality of human nature. To rise above dichotomized nationalism, patriotism, or ethnocentrism, in the sense of them against us, or of we-they, or Ardrey's enmity-amity complex. For example, Piaget's little Genevan boy who couldn't imagine being both Genevan and Swiss. He could think of being only either Genevan or Swiss. It takes more development in order to able to be more inclusive and superordinate, more integrative. My identification with nationalism, patriotism, or with my culture does not necessarily mitigate against my identification in more inclusive higher patriotism with the human species or with the United Nations. As a matter of fact, such a superordinate patriotism is, of course, not only more inclusive, but therefore more healthy, more fully human, than the strict localism which is regarded as antagonistic or as excluding others. That is, I can be a good American, and of course must be an American, that's the culture I grew up in, which I can never shake off and I don't want to shake off in favor of being a world citizen. Stress that the world citizen who has no roots, who doesn't belong any place, who is utterly and merely cosmopolitan, is not as good a world citizen as one who grew up in the family, in a place, in a home with a particular language, in a particular culture, and therefore has a sense of belongingness on which to build toward higher needed and meta-need levels. To be a full member of the human species does not mean repudiating the lower levels, it means rather including them in the hierarchical integration, for example, cultural pluralism, enjoying the differences, enjoying different kinds of restaurants with different kinds of food, enjoying travel to other countries, enjoying the ethnological study of other cultures, etc.
Environmentalist Hypocrisy. William Wildblood. I mentioned to an acquaintance this morning, someone who is a signed-up devotee of the Green religion, that if the Greens were really serious about saving the planet and looming environmental catastrophe, they would immediately push hard for the banning of all immigration, legal, illegal, the lot. His head practically exploded and he flailed around trying to find a flaw in this argument, which is based on the undeniable fact that people in the first world cause more damage to the environment, consume more, have a greater carbon footprint, etc., etc., than those in the third. His face got redder and redder. There's a clue there, isn't there? True colors revealed. And he spluttered and mumbled but could only come up with the feeble irrelevancy that some rich people in the third world have a greater environmental impact than poor people in the first. But when I replied this meant we should only allow rich immigrants into the first world and ban all poor ones, it was all too much and he left the room. I mention this just to show that a substantial percentage of modern environmentalists do not really love nature, still less God who created nature, at all. Far too many of them are motivated by those good old-fashioned values of hatred and resentment. They want to destroy, not create. But you knew that, didn't you? By the way, I write this as someone who doesn't drive, rarely flies and was a vegetarian for 25 years. I consume as little as possible, and I would gladly see a vast reduction in our desecration of the natural world, use of plastic, pollution of air, earth and water, and so on and so on. But I want to see this driven by love of God and creation, not hatred of humanity. The agnostic matrix versus real reality and truth, the world versus you and me. Bruce Charlton. There has been a long-term, multi-generational, establishment-backed strategy of convincing the masses, i.e. as many people as possible, that this world is some kind of simulation, hologram, a UN-rooted surface, virtual world, a fake, the Matrix. This goes with the idea that there is no truth, or that the truth is inaccessible to the human senses, mind and thinking, and the only dangerous people are those who believe there is a truth and that they can know it. There is a dominant ethic which has it that agnosticism is the highest virtue, that not knowing and knowing that one does not know, is the only really valid basis for life, that doubt is a higher state than knowing, and, again, that the only really dangerous people are those who decide, take responsibility for their decisions, and act upon them. Fundamentalists, in other words, to use the jargon. Of course it can with equal truth be shown that the establishment also desire that the masses should believe absolutely and do obediently whatever the establishment are telling them, today. And that this today's truth and today's must-do morality are absolute and permanently valid, because the fact they differ from last year, and may be reversed next week, does not affect the overwhelming factuality and ethical imperative of the present moment. This is our world. But such a world, in its own reality, perfectly complements the prevalent, living in a simulation, know-nothing agnosticism. As soon as any subject or issue has been raised, there can be no knowledge vacuum. Raising the subject, and the frame in which it is raised, itself intrinsically assumes prior knowledge and values. Thought as content, and content assumes its own external reality and conceptual interpretation. Neutrality is incoherent because concepts always include values. Hence what is being asked of the masses, non-judgment, eternal doubt, is strictly impossible, therefore it does not happen. And that is why the Matrix says one thing, believe nothing, but people do the opposite. I believe everything the Matrix says, currently, and that is exactly what the Matrix intends. The Matrix masses combine maximum cynicism and total obedience. The Matrix is experientially the world we live in, and we also are told, by the Matrix itself, sometimes explicitly, and in 1,000 indirect ways, as well as in hundreds of analogical and hypothetical ways, by fictions in TV, movies, novels, that the Matrix is the world we live in. But why, how, did this Matrix happen? Well, there can be no because in agnostic Matrix world, therefore the Matrix just happened, just goes on happening, under its own internal logic, aiming nowhere in particular, because a matrix can have no purpose. Thus, a further very popular, heavily propagandized backup theory is that matrix manipulators do not exist because stuff just happens due to emergence, the market, chaos theory, forces and laws, historical cycles, progression or degenerations, and so forth. There is no covert purpose, no hidden hand, no intent of evil. Ultimately because randomness. The only permissible and high-brow spirituality is oneness. This claim labels the Matrix as this world, temporary, because time-bound, fake and illusory reality, as contrasted with acclaimed knowledge derived from standing outside the Matrix, in an ultimate, eternal, changeless, unity. Oneness spirituality, supposedly derived from Hinduism, Buddhism and the mystic East, feeds this agnostic matrix view of reality, because everything is actually the same thing, good and evil are illusions, as are truth and lies, innocence or blame. For oneness, this life is all illusion and no truth. The enlightened man realizes that he knows nothing, his thoughts are deceptions, his discernments are just ego, his self is actually not a self but just a minuscule part of the one. Our hope should be that our self should cease to be differentiated from that one, then illusion will fall away, including the illusion of our own suffering. Oneness says, cheer up. You are not really miserable, because you are too brief, insignificant and deluded for your misery to mean anything. So much for the negatives. Then we must ask, if not, then what? If not the agnostic matrix, what else is possible, or better? We can only legitimately recognize the evil of the matrix from some other place that is not a part of the matrix world, just as we can only recognize agnosticism from having made decisions about what assumptions are correct. Indeed, the whole matrix operates, all the time, by creating and dissolving temporary and matrix-expedient rules, truths, values, assumptions, and everything else positive. Or else, there is nothing, nihil, nihilism, and ultimate despair. From where we are here and now, it does not work to wall off some part of the matrix, in hope that it will then operate on different lines. The matrix covered the world in 2020, for all to see, and has neither been repented nor repudiated anywhere, not even in its essentials, let alone wholly. No nation has escaped the matrix, no nation has clearly said they even want to escape, no nation, nor even any institution of size and power enough to be able to do it. Meanwhile here we are, you and me. We surely can't wait for other people, whether a nation, a region, a locality, a church, to create a real world that we can inhabit. Life goes on, and must be lived with some purpose, or else it will be as futile as the oneness matrixites tell us. Death approaches. Therefore, we must find reality and truth for ourselves, starting from what we know, and ignoring the secondary and separate question of whether we can convince others, whether we can create a community of like-minded others. Ignoring, because we very probably cannot and will not be able to share our truths, the world being what it is. And this is where Christian faith comes in. And it must be Christian faith. Because only the Christian God is Creator, good, and our loving Father, so can be depended upon and able to make possible whatever is necessary for our salvation, and to make our continued mortal life worthwhile from an eternal perspective, and only Jesus can guarantee that eternity to those who genuinely want it. The matrix is everywhere and very powerful. But we can nonetheless, on our own, you and me, confidently defy the vast fake world of the matrix, can discern and think our way to a sufficiently solid basis of correct information, positive values, and therefore true knowledge. The alternative? Well, living in the agnostic matrix is worse than living in the matrix of the movies, because, unlike there, the masses of the world in 2023 know that they live in a fake reality. The masses know this because, unlike in the movie, the establishment who operate the matrix tell people they are living in the matrix, tell them over and again. And that is the other crucial difference between the movie and this life. In the movie, the masses are being exploited as sources of energy, therefore it is better they are kept in ignorance. But here and now, in this world, the purpose of the matrix is damnation of men's souls. It is therefore valuable that the masses inhabit the matrix, and are aware of the fact, thus men may be induced to despair. And despair is the surest of all paths to damnation. When men inhabit the matrix, and when they also know that the matrix is what they inhabit, they are consenting to the matrix. And when the matrix is evil by intent and design, then men are consenting to evil. This is what the matrix manipulators need to happen. Need, because of the work of Jesus Christ, means that it is only when men consent to evil that they will refuse salvation and are damned. Jesus came to save sinners, and sinning is no bar to salvation, so long as sin is acknowledged as such, and the man desires the resurrection offered by Christ. This is, ultimately, why the establishment makes sure that we know what they are doing to us, and then try to ensure that we accept it, that is, that what they do is for the best. Modern mainstream skepticism is a single-edged weapon. Bruce Charlton. Asking fundamental questions has become a necessity for salvation and good living, but, At the same time, skeptical doubt has, for many generations, been a tool for the demolition of religion. So, how is good deep questioning to be distinguished from its evil doppelganger, that is designed to subvert, demoralize, demotivate and despair-induce? Genuine questioning of fundamental assumptions is called metaphysics, and it is characterized by the honest recognition that all legitimate doubt functions as a double-edged sword. That is, doubt is always based on some assumptions, assumed fundamental truths, assumed valid methods, assumed values etc., and these must be turned against themselves. The sword cuts both ways, therefore only those metaphysical assumptions that can survive being turned against themselves can be regarded as even potentially genuine. By stark contrast, the mainstream, modern, officially approved doubts and skepticisms are single-edged weapons, weapons that cannot cut the wielder, and are designed purely for attack. The wielder of such typically leftist, destructive critiques as we observe in the discourses of atheism, the sexual revolution, diversity etc. is always engaged in slashing attacks, and is protected by institutional power and privilege from any need to defend his own assumptions and methods from confrontations against his own assumptions and methods. True, valid, well-motivated skepticism cuts on the backstroke, therefore kills the wielder. Unless he is proof against his own weapon. And that is how we know that positive, truth-motivated metaphysics is afoot, rather than negative destructive evil. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and a Metaphysic of Qualities. Bruce Charlton. Owen Barfield, in his introduction to What Coleridge Thought, 1971, comments that S.D. Coleridge's philosophical work was aiming to institute a metaphysic and science of qualities. I would modify this to suggest that all metaphysics ought to be concerned, primarily, with qualities. Metaphysical qualities refer to the building blocks from which we construct our worldview, our understanding of fundamental reality. Such qualities are what underlie all specific and quantitative discourses, such as the various sciences. For instance, the metaphysical question of whether the basic units of reality are living beings or instead abstract particles, waves, forces, fields etc. Almost everything hinges on which assumption we make, which fundamental qualities we regard as primary. If we assume that fundamental reality is a matter of physics, then we cannot discover life, consciousness or purpose in the universe, since these are all excluded by assumptions. All possible apparent instances of life/consciousness/purpose must, by assumption, be reducible to physical causes and explanations. Conversely, if the fundamental reality is assumed to be constituted by beings, then everything that is and happens will, ultimately, be derivable from life/consciousness/purpose/motivation/meaning, and other attributes of beings. Thus metaphysical assumptions are far more important than any specialized discourse, and this importance is likely to be most lethally, and inescapably, damaging, when actual metaphysical assumptions are unconscious or denied. Feminist Hypocrisy. William Wildblood. This is an article by someone who has burnt down the cornfield, and is now surprised to find that nothing grows properly in it. Worse, she is using the situation to display her broad-mindedness and insightfulness and maybe even as a business opportunity. Unfortunately, she has no idea what she is talking about, as she seems to think that men are just imperfect versions of women. It is going to be increasingly noticeable that people who jumped on board with and eagerly participated in the dismantling of traditional wisdom are going to be shocked at the latest phase of that which they so eagerly pursued. How many of them will have the humility and wisdom to realize they have made a mistake, reassess their priorities and go back to basics as a result? Few, I predict. Most will just lament the most recent development but remain blind to what caused it, as with the feminists who resist the transgender movement, which is just a natural progression of their own ideology. They will be unable to see they have brought this about themselves. The leftists, the globalists, the feminists, the internationalists, no borders, the materialists, the atheists and a whole host of other spiritual deviants will wring their hands and say this is not what we meant, when it is the direct result of their thoughts and writings and words and actions. They will refuse to see the obvious, blinded by the shadows cast by their own egos. No one likes to admit having made a mistake, still less having propagated and promoted lies for their whole adult life. But unless they take the opportunity offered by being shown the consequences of their intellectual and spiritual errors, they will not escape from the darkness of self-serving ideology into the light and freedom of truth. Sinners are forgiven but only when they repent, and repentance cannot be partial or conditional. It is all or it is nothing. Those who have built systems of thought and behavior on the denial of God must wake up to what they have done and go back the whole way to the point at which their path deviated from divine reality. They cannot just retrace a few steps and try to preserve their error in an ego-saving maneuver which will do them no spiritual good at all. They must dig out the roots of the error, or it will simply put forth new shoots. The yearning for immersive belonging, and the fear of self-deception. Bruce Charlton. There is, and has been for many generations, deep yearning for a life that is one of immersive belonging. It has many individual and cultural manifestations: the yearning for the idyllic aspects of early childhood, for primitive tribal societies, for a future age of Aquarius in which we are all united with everything in a state of cosmic consciousness. This intense combination of nostalgia and the hope of escape from suffering and angst goes with the assumption that this needs to overwhelm us, and that overwhelming is a measure of authenticity, truth, validity. In other words, what we want is that we ourselves and everyone in the world will be transformed, will be made anew, even against our resistance. So, this yearning fantasy is also one in which we desire to be unfree. It is, perhaps covertly, a rejection of our freedom as having caused existential loneliness, division and misery. It is a hope that this alienating freedom will be dissolved away into a state of blissful connectedness. I think that some such mistrust, even hatred, of freedom and active agency underlies the great fear of self-deception that afflicts, and too often paralyzes, modern people. I mean, the idea that if we take an active role in attaining knowledge, then that knowledge will be tainted by our own wishful thinking. This, then, is the flip side of the above described idea that valid and authentic knowledge is, ought to be, overwhelming, that what is true must be irresistible. It is also perhaps exactly this feeling or expectation that underlies the self-annihilating spiritual death and chosen slavery of the majority of modern men. Modern man has a profound mistrust of himself, of his personal capacity and motivation to seek what is true and good, a kind of terror of following any line of thinking that steps out with the overwhelming and immersive ocean of external influences. Any other person who is suspected of doing this, of genuinely working from himself, may well become an object of fear or ridicule, and perhaps loathing. Even worse is when this is incipiently detected in oneself, a thinking actively from oneself that launches out beyond immersive external influences. Stop it at once. There is thus a profound mistrust of free and active, independent thinking, which mistrust is only made worse by the fact of its joyousness, and sense of self-validating truth and creative flow. For Christians, this self-mistrust may be made worse by some version of the conviction of original sin, which conviction can induce self-loathing and a craving to be controlled. So, in the end, mankind en masse has willingly submitted to the mind control of global totalitarianism, as administered by its converged and controlled pseudo-Christian churches. And all the time the answer, the path to escape, lay unused and indeed rejected, located within the mind and capability of every man. Christianity as divine bureaucracy, or, behold, the salvation credit system. Francis Berger. Nothing amazes and depresses me more than seeing Christians who recognize the inherent evil of modern bureaucracy and bureaucratic systems yet simultaneously insist upon a Christianity that fundamentally resides in the realm of officialdom, and boils down to the following of centralized administrative procedures that must be followed to a T to be valid, effective, and authentic. Such Christians are sharp enough to discern the harmonic evil in the various totalitarian schemes the globalist demon spawn try to implement, yet muddled enough to believe that a technical glitch in some regulatory or organizational procedure is more than enough to render salvation null and void, regardless of the heartfelt, faith-based motivation of the individuals involved. Such Christians are quick to decry godless and dehumanizing bureaucratic networks like biodemic pet passports or social credit systems that unfairly and maliciously encroach upon an individual's freedom to travel, work, and associate, but are equally quick to laud the necessity of Christian regulatory framework analogous to a salvation credit system that holistically assesses the Christian worthiness of individuals before relegating them to the great Christian blacklist. Such Christians reduce Christianity to the level of policymaking and diminish God to the level of policymaker. Faith is circumscribed by the administrative, the ministerial, the rule-bound, the managerial, the rigid, the inflexible, the procedural, the organizational, and the regulatory. Everything must line up. Every I has to be dotted, every T crossed, because the presence of even the smallest snag nullifies everything. To such Christians, I pose the following questions. Do you really believe God works like that? Do you really believe God would purposefully organize the world in such a way? Do you really believe that represents who Jesus was during his mission on earth or his offer of salvation and heaven? Do you really believe that the divine operates at the same level and employs the same methods as the demonic totalitarians via their ever-encroaching and ever-increasing legalistic oppression and subjugation? Is that all Christianity is in the end? Another credit system? A divine bureaucracy? Or could it be that this conceptualization of Christianity as divine bureaucracy is the fruit of a now limited, exteriorized religious consciousness that should be outgrown and surpassed lest Christianity become a religion of passports, digital IDs, and barcode readers? The fatal problem of mapping abstract metaphysics onto this world, the advantage of a metaphysics of beings. Bruce Charlton. It may seem strange that I keep hammering away at a metaphysics that regards beings as the fundamental unit of reality, but this comes at the end of some decades of trying to make the available, conventional metaphysical assertions work in my life, in real life. All the mainstream systems of metaphysics since the ancient Greeks invented the subject, have been abstract, that is, they posit some real reality behind this world, of which there are no assumable examples in this world we inhabit. And there is never a way by which we can confidently map the abstract metaphysical schema onto the minutiae of this world, or interpret the specifics this world in terms of exact aspects of the metaphysics. For me this has, in the end, always proved to be a fatal problem. Sooner or later, I have had to discard all such theories. For example, Plato's theory of eternal, timeless ideas behind the mutable actualities of this world. We can discuss these ideals with parable-like worked examples, as Plato does, but cannot point to any actual ideal that foresaw or explains any specific thing in this world, because the relationship between the ideal and worldly is not knowable within the metaphysical system. Indeed, a qualitative difference between this temporal world and the eternal real ideal is the basis of the metaphysics. More clearly, the forms of Aristotle, that were adopted by Aquinas, are abstractions that explain what we observe in this world, but what is a for-sure example of a form? How can I tell what is the form at work in any particular instance of this world? A more recent example derived from Aristotle is Rupert Sheldrake's adaptation of these Aristotelian forms as morphogenetic fields, which exist and act everywhere. These can be posited as explanations, but cannot be known directly. We cannot observe a morphogenetic field, nor say which exist or how many exist, nor describe and discuss the nature and scope of a specific morphogenetic field. A further abstract entity I engaged with was systems, as found in Luhmann's systems theory. Indeed, I got very deep into this form of explanation, and published quite a lot of work under its influence. Yet the systems of systems theory are abstractions. It is not possible within the realm of systems theory, to know whether some phenomenon in this world is, or is not, a system. Indeed, it is part of systems theory that knowledge is only possible within systems, so one system can only infer another. And even within systems, a knowing subsystem can only infer about the system as a whole, based upon finite sampling and finite complexity of processing. Nor can we identify what are the real abstract systems, we cannot count them, nor classify them, their reality is wholly hypothetical. Thus when I attempted to explain any particular thing in terms of systems theory, I could only guess at what system or systems, or no system at all, were involved in this phenomenon. In other words, as is usual with abstract metaphysics, we cannot map abstractions onto everyday reality, nor can we discover what specific everyday instances are instances of particular abstractions, whether ideal/form or morphogenetic field. And these cannots, these limitations, are fundamental to the metaphysics themselves. In other words, the metaphysical theory itself includes among assumptions that its relationship to this world cannot be known. The great advantage I find about a metaphysics based on beings, is that while I do not know all beings nor all about beings, I do know the identity several beings for sure, starting with myself. I am sure that I am a being, and, almost, equally sure that several members of my family are beings. So there is a real world and direct mapping of metaphysics onto reality, that cannot be matched by any abstract metaphysical system. For me, this ability to map the theory onto experienced reality is a very powerful, indeed decisive, difference between positing systems like those of Plato/Aristotle/Aquinas/Sheldrake/Luhmann, and what I am doing with the metaphysics of beings. This business of thinking, why such an emphasis here? Bruce Charlton. Over the past years I must have written hundreds of blog posts that are focused on thinking. But thinking of a particular kind, and in a particular context. It really is extraordinarily difficult to get across the centrality of this, and I have rather floundered around with various nomenclatures: primary thinking, heart thinking, direct knowing. These are some of them. The basic idea came from Rudolf Steiner, and I found it very difficult to grasp. The best source is his Philosophy of Freedom, written when Steiner was in his 30s, and before he became a theosophist and cult leader. But for me the penny didn't drop, until after I had read, or rather listened to, as an audiobook by Dale Brunsvold, Steiner's PhD thesis published as Truth and Knowledge, and also Otto Palmer's book of excerpts of Steiner's own comments on Philosophy of Freedom. I hoped that I would be able to provide readers of this blog with an easier and more direct route to understanding what Steiner meant, and free of the obscuring accretions that theosophy brought. As I have often said, my greatest strength as a philosopher is that I know when I have not got something, and therefore when I want to get something, I know to keep on returning, and keep banging away at the problem, until either I do get it, or know that I can't. This was the case with Steiner's Philosophy of Freedom. Anyway, I have described what this thinking is like, as an experience, so that it can be recognized when/if it happens, how it can be distinguished from mundane thinking, i.e. from the ordinary, everyday activity that most people think is all of thinking. Yet actually doing primary thinking is only half of what is needed, And somebody might experience this frequently and yet get none of the positively transformative benefits it potentially contains. This is because we need to know the significance of primary thinking, know its importance in man's destiny, especially Western man, and even more especially those whose racial and cultural backgrounds are from the British Isles, Western, and Central Europe, Scandinavia. And, for this, we need to know what is happening in primary thinking, where it comes from, its provenance, in terms of our self, our real, divine, primary self, as contrasted with the externally constructed, mortal, surface personality or persona. We need to know why primary thinking is valid, i.e. valid within the constraints of our mortal incarnation into this entropic world. In other words, half of primary thinking is our explicit, conscious, and chosen knowledge of what it is, and the other half is actually doing it. Unless we are conscious of the situation, unless both understanding and practice are in place, unless we are doing all this by choice and taking responsibility for the business, then primary thinking is of not much help, or no help at all, to our situation in the world. It sounds hopelessly complicated. But the complications seem to arise from the problem of getting past established, mostly unconscious, assumptions and recognizing something very simple and clear which was there all the time but needed to become explicitly known and chosen, at least that was my case. It's one of those things that is hard to get, but when it is got then that is that. It is clear and obvious, and everything is changed by it. Primary creation, of God the Father, is opt-out, the second creation, of Jesus Christ, is opt-in. Bruce Charlton. The primary creation was imposed upon the pre-existing and eternal beings by God. This imposition was by necessity. Before creation, beings existed in isolation and without relationships, thus direction, purpose and meaning in a creation based upon love emerged only after primary creation. In this sense, also, freedom and the capacity for an agency based on distinguishing the self from the not-self was only possible post-creation. I.e., we cannot know we are a self until after we know of other selves. Therefore it was impossible for any being to opt out of creation, until after creation, because there could be no consent to creation, nor of opting, until after creation had happened, hence the necessity for its imposition. But love is by mutual consent only, and this meant that beings were incorporated into primary creation without consent, and, it seems, some of them withdrew consent almost immediately. To be clear, all the beings of creation, even Satan, the first rebel against God, have been, even if briefly, subordinated to God's creation. Probably some who withdrew consent, who rapidly opted out of creation, were incapable of love, probably others were capable of love, but did not wish to make love the basis of organization. Those who opted out include what we regard as Satan and the demons, in other words these were never incarnated spirit beings. Because primary creation cannot be undone or reversed, because now beings know about each other, the rebel's ultimate or distal goal, insofar as they are explicitly aware of it, is a power-based reality, in which beings are in a situation of antagonism and attempted domination or exploitation, which themselves, and, maybe, some recruits, as the dominant exploiters. In a nutshell, the demons, and all others who have rejected love/God/creation at some later point, aspire to a reality based on relationships of power and selfishness. Thus they have chosen to opt out of primary creation. In primary creation, which was all of creation before the advent of Jesus Christ, God operates as a power acting upon us, i.e. upon beings. In a sense, God does creation to us. Living in creation is therefore the default situation, from which we would need to opt out if we did not want it. This imposed creation situation was recognized by all the old religions, and still is recognized, at least implicitly, by those religions that have a supreme God but do not recognize the truth and desirability of Jesus Christ. Therefore the old gods, and the understanding of the ancient monotheistic God of the Hebrews or the later God of Islam, regard God as primarily power. And such a God of non-optional imposed creation demands of us obedient service above all else, which goes with a relationship as essentially one of awe, fear, submission, propitiation etc. that is, a relationship analogous to that of an ignorant peasant towards the absolute emperor of vast domains. As I said, this attitude is a natural consequence of the primary creation in which creation was done to us. Our understanding of and relationship to God is of one who is done to, who is insignificant, not one who participates in, or who himself contributes something of substantive value. The secondary creation was made to happen by Jesus Christ, and this fundamentally changed our relation with God. The second creation was, for the first time, an opt-in situation, and made God, potentially, the supreme beloved father of a vast family, rather than king of a people. Since the second creation, God no longer requires or desires us to regard him as primarily a power, but a loving parent. God no longer requires our obedient submission to his imposed authority, but invites our loving participation in his continuing work of creation. The secondary creation involves beings that are already free agents, and who know about other beings. It involves making the choice of an eternal commitment to live harmoniously with other beings guided by, and in a condition of, mutual love. This secondary creation mode of being is achieved by the willing transformation that is resurrection, and the second creation is called heaven, a situation where we go by our own active desire. In the second creation, we are not supposed to regard God as remote, incomprehensible, as like a monarch or a judge before which we ought to abase ourselves in submission and obedience. And we are not supposed to regard ourselves as insignificant, superfluous, functionless, but as irreplaceable and able to add something worthwhile to what is, across eternity. We are instead supposed to have an attitude to God of love, gratitude, joy, positivity, energy, excitement, a desire to bring the best of ourselves to the work of God's divine family, to join in with the plans of divine creating. Because the second creation is opt-in, some who reject God include those who opted out after becoming incarnated into this mortal life. They lived in primary creation as premortal spirits without opting out, but after they were born as men, they made the decision, whether before or after death, not to opt into the second creation. To clarify, because the second creation is opt-in, there are those who positively reject the second or the first creation, presumably Satan and the demons, but probably others too, but also those who negatively do not want the second creation. These may still be prepared not to opt out from the first creation. These would include many religious but not Christian people, including some self-identified Christians who actually don't want what Jesus offers. The difference between dwelling in the first and second creation is therefore a vital difference for Christians to grasp, if they are not to fall into an attitude to God that fits the opt-out primary, but not the opt-in secondary creation. Christians who get their idea of God from the pre-Jesus era of the Jews of the Old Testament, tend to have the negative attitudes of the first creation, for example the primacy of obedience to power, but fail to understand or embrace the essential qualitative difference that Jesus made. Such people are sometimes therefore de facto non-Christians, in terms of their attitudes and expectations, and their desires. But the reality is that Jesus Christ changed the fundamental possibilities of reality. Things are possible since Jesus that were not possible before Jesus. The big question is whether we personally want what Jesus made possible, or not. If we want it, we each must choose it. We must then opt in. A funeral? William Wildblood. I went to a funeral yesterday. The deceased had had a long life and a distinguished career and was much loved by friends and family. It was a successful life well lived, but he had been a religious skeptic up until nearly the very end. But not apparently at the very end. The canon who gave the address related how he had visited this man a few days before he died, and they talked about the afterlife. Naturally, one's approaching end concentrates the mind and you become more open to things you may previously have dismissed. Their reality or otherwise is suddenly a matter of pressing importance. The canon said he had asked his friend, for they were friends, to imagine he was speaking to a baby just before it was born. What would he say? Something like this perhaps. You are now in a dark, safe and secure place where your every need is met. You have nothing to do except to be and grow peacefully in silence. But very soon all that will change. You will come out into a world of light and sound and other people. You will change and form relationships. There will be challenges you will be required to meet and suffering too in all probability, but there will also be love, joy and fulfillment in various ways, for some more than others, but for all there will be opportunity to make some kind of mark, great or small. How could the as yet unborn child understand any of this? But if he could, then might there not be excitement at the prospect? In the same way, said the canon, you are about to leave one form and phase of life for another. Your horizons will be hugely expanded in ways you cannot now envisage, but if you approach this change with hope in your heart and a faithful mind, all will be well. I thought this was a good way of looking at things. After all, birth and death are two sides of the same coin. We come from mystery, and at the end of our life we return to mystery. It's like the famous story told by the Venerable Bede in his account of the conversion of King Edwin of Northumbria of the sparrow that flies into a warm hall out of a wintry night and then out again at the far end of the hall. There is a great world outside the hall, and the sparrow continues his journey. Likewise, we too are on a journey, and death is but a stage on that journey, an important one to be sure, but still only a stage. It is not the end. Apparently the dying man was reconciled at the end with the prospect of a new life in which he would meet his loved ones who had gone on before, and he ventured forth with a newly found hope in his heart. I believe in some kind of purgatorial purification after death, so a simple shift of belief is but the beginning, but I also believe that it is a necessary beginning, and if we open our hearts to the reality of the spiritual life, even if that is only at the end as it was in this case, then we face towards the light and move in the right direction on the next stage of our journey. The cause of our current insanity is perfectly simple: spiritual atheism. Bruce Charlton. There have been innumerable books and articles on the causes of the current literal insanity. But the underlying cause is simply atheism. To explain a little, the cause is atheism, de facto atheism, and its consequences. De facto, because nearly all religious people nowadays are actually materialists, even in their religion. And the consequence is that most religious people are as bad atheists as the explicit, strident variety. Atheism is a spiritual state, more than a belief. It is very difficult, and unusual not to be a spiritual atheist. To think and live on the basis that there is no God, and that this world and life are not an ongoing creation. And that is the problem we should be working on. God is love, but what about creation? Bruce Charlton. For Christians, love is the primary value, but only when that love comes with understanding. Love, isolated, is useless to us, destructive to society. Mainstream Christians blab a lot about love, but you can tell they understand love to be just an emotion. Their love takes place against a background of materialism, a lifeless universe of randomness and physics. But a real understanding of love is that love is bound up with creation, love is God's motivation for creation, is the organizing principle of creation, love is the cohesion and purpose of all that has meaning. Christians, of all people, must not mutilate love into a physical emotion restricted to functional animals during mortal life, or some deadly reduction of love to instinct, sex, or dependency. These are demonic strategies of damnation. Their ubiquity among Christian leaders is evidence of the depth and breadth of our corruption. Love is not encapsulated. Love connects us as individuals to the reason for creation, to consciousness, to our free agency. Love is also the root to all good futures. It must underpin all free and creative thinking, all right choices, all positive ideas, actions and policies. We are bound to creation by love, but love is only good when truly understood and when chosen as our fundamental basis. Therefore, we should not parrot love discourse, without also understanding love in the largest, most metaphysical sense. Or else love will become an instrument of destruction.